Just Imagine, a podcast series by Imagine Theatre.
Yes, hello again and welcome to episode 118 of this podcast series, and this time we're discussing another stock pantomime title, and it's the turn of one of the oldest and most popular of all time, Aladdin.
For more information, go to their website at www.imaginetheatre.co.uk.
Now, in the last episode, I spoke to the stage, television and radio singer, comedian, impressionist, the fabulous entertainer and panto veteran, Hilary O'Neill. So far in the series, we've met all sorts of fascinating guests, from celebrities and backstage team members to practitioners and academics. We've discussed specific panto characters and titles, talked about how pantomime is produced, its history and its future. Now, there is an index to all of the 100 plus episodes we've done so far. You can check them out where you normally get your podcasts from and look at the index on the Imagine Theatre website. And of course, while you're checking out the episodes, don't forget to subscribe to the series so you don't miss out in the future. Now, in this episode, we have the latest in our occasional series looking at the popular pantomime titles, and I've been joined by the theatre director, actor and educator, David Ashley.
Hello everyone, it's lovely to be on this glorious podcast with you, Martin.
And the senior curator of modern and contemporary performance at the Victoria and Albert Museum, curator of the National Database of Pantomime Performance, and founder and coordinator of the National Panto Day, Simon Sladen. How are you?
Hello, it's lovely to be back, Martin.
And we're going to talk about Aladdin, and this is an interesting one. This is probably one of the titles that has to evolve more than others, and we'll get to that a little bit later on. But Simon, let's talk about the origins of the story, because when people go and see it, especially when they compare it to the Disney movie, they get confused because it has Chinese and Arabian sort of elements to it. And many people believe that it was one of the original tales of the Arabian Nights. But of course, its origins were in China, weren't they?
Yes, I mean, gosh, when Disney wrote those wonderful lyrics, A Whole New World, every season seems to bring a whole new world. But Aladdin, as we reappraise and we look at it. But let's go way, way back. Almost quoting from Joseph there many centuries ago, because of course Aladdin and Alibaba were not originally part of what have become known as the 1001 Nights or the Arabian Nights. We have 12 volumes of that published between 1704 and 1717, and they were added by Frenchman Antoine Gallard, and they were based on a folk tale that he had heard from a Syrian storyteller. So we have him to thank for, I suppose, capturing and recording that tale of Aladdin, the lamp, the magical genies, and the evolution, as you said, is absolutely vast. We see the first pantomimes arriving in about 1788 at Covent Garden, and it's interesting, from that very early production, the presentation is not of a particular place, but of the Orient, of the East. And the costumes, which we look at reports and reviews, talk about it being a combination of Japanese, Chinese and Persian styles. And the pantomime becomes set in Peking. The stories, most of the translations of the stories talk about either Baghdad, and of course the pantomime world, still many today, are set in China. So Covent Garden, 1788, we have this first production. In 1813, we get the pantomime dame, different name than that we are aware of. She's called Widow Ching Mustafa. And then in 1861 is where we really see the telling of the contemporary tale, or the tale that maybe we know the most happening. H.J. Byron writes Aladdin or the Wonderful Scamp, you know, the wonderful punning that goes on there, Scamp and Lamp, at the Strand Theatre in 1861. And that's where we see, well, we thought until very recently that was the first Widow Twankey. But Professor Kate Newey's been doing a lot of research into this. And actually, a dame with the name of Twankey appears much earlier in Old Nick the Railway King, or Harlequin and the Chinese Queen of the Golden Pagoda in 1845. And interestingly, the dame there is the Empress, and the Empress is called Empress Twankey Tea Na. Now, Twankey tea was a tea that was drunk widely. It was very cheap tea. Interesting that the tea Na sounds a bit like Tina. Well, I'm not sure that was a common name at that time. And she was married to the Emperor Twankey Tea No, N-O-H. So whether that was some jokes about not wanting tea or wanting tea, but N-O-H is also Japanese form of theatre, no theatre. So we're already seeing this absolute melting pot of cultures, and at that point, an opportunity to engage, indulge in non-Western culture, not really paying attention to some of those cultural sensitivities about how specific cultural iconography is. And we see this developing through 1874, big production at Drury Lane. 1896 at Drury Lane, we get the character Wishy-Washy introduced to us. And of course, all through this time, Aladdin has been played as a female principal boy. Big changes happen in 1956 when Norman Wisdom plays Aladdin in a production called The Wonderful Lamp at the Palladium, really celebrating, cementing the male comedic principal boy. And there've been other people that have played a key role in the evolution of that form, from Danny LaRue's Widow Twankey, for example, Ian McKellen's at the Old Vic, Paul O'Grady, and a number of female dames, Dora Bryan, Nellie Wallace, Elaine C. Smith, for example. I mean, we can't really talk about the history of Aladdin without the 1992 Disney film. Prior to that, the princess would have most likely have been Baudrubaldor, which translates as the full moon of full moons. Princess Jasmine is probably what she's going to be called today. Having said that, and maybe we'll talk about this a little bit later, over the past 10 years, that history has absolutely been super turbo moved forward with the progressions that have been made as we come to look at the representation of non-Western cultures and non-British cultures on the stage and think about how are we casting that? How are we representing that? What does that mean when the villain, one of the original names for the villain, yes, Abanazar, but also the African magician, whether they were from Morocco, whether they were from Egypt, we're seeing a lot of the politics of the Victorian era play out. And of course, we're no longer in the Victorian era. We need to address those. We need to think about what that means and how we're representing our multicultural Britain today.
Yeah, we'll talk a bit more about that a little bit later on. David, in terms of the plot, this is it's my favorite pantomime. I think partly because of the dame role. I think it's the most rewarding dame role to play, in that she's involved throughout. She's very much part of the plot and in many ways drives it more so than some of the other dames. But it's got everything, this show, David, hasn't it? And you've played Twanky more times than you probably dare to remember.
I know, I was just trying to think. It was my first foray into damehood, actually, down a long time ago at the Salisbury Playhouse. I have to agree with you, Martin. It's one of my favourites as well. And I think one of the reasons it's one of my favourites, like Jack and the Beanstalk, it's led by the family. The idea that there is a family unit which is struggling, which is working as hard as it can, that has these kind of offshoots of sons who are not being the best people that they can be, understandably in some situations. I think as a family unit at the heart of a panto, I think it serves it brilliantly because people can relate to that almost immediately. That it's Twanky is an incredibly brilliant role to play, and she can get away with a lot more, I think, than a lot of panto dames because it's kept within that family unit. But I think that's where the key lies to this story and how it's. I know we'll get to the evolution in a bit, but I think that's what is really key at the heart of it, because that story can transcend everything, because it always does, because of everybody, if they're lucky enough, can have a really thriving family unit to build on.
Now, we often talk about some of the elements that make a good panto, and we've discussed the fact that you don't need all of the elements in every panto, but as long as you've got most of them, a panto will be successful. And in this, there are some unique elements that you won't find in any other pantos. They have similar themes, but I'm talking about things like having three wishes, things like the magic carpet, the flying carpet, and of course the Cave of Wonders, amongst other things, David. These are all unique elements that actually make this stand out as well, aren't they?
Absolutely. And of course, all those elements you just mentioned can prove to be very, very expensive to kind of for a producing kind of perspective. But of course, we can't forget the glorious laundry scene where everything should go wrong in terms of washing. So I think, yeah, there are some spectacular elements that can happen. And also, in true theatrical style, I'm a bit old school as well. I believe that the magic can be created really simply. It doesn't have to have all the whistles and all the bells. It can be done in a way which is really extraordinary, but actually quite simple. But yeah, those elements are always going to be a producer's a little bit of a nightmare, thinking how can we create this and not, make a cave of wonders explode out of the floor or drop in from the sky, or that's a lot. It's a lot of money, isn't it?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I don't know if you're aware of this, Simon, but that whole sort of premise of being granted three magical wishes actually dates back to the third century. It goes back, much further than the story of Aladdin. But it's an interesting concept, isn't it?
It is an interesting concept because I think it is one of the pantomimes where people have to choose. The intervention from the benevolent agent or the fairy is not that they're going to help at every single time that their help is required. And of course, historically and traditionally, at the end, it's a very interesting aspect that the third wish often frees the genie from the lamp. Of course, many productions and many translations, and I believe the original story, it was sort of unlimited wishes. And it's interesting to see contemporary writers thinking
Mm,
about what that means in society today. Because if we did get everything we want, what would we be happy actually? And
mm,
is that actually a solution to the problems? I think there's also things about, how much you work hard for something and put things in. But that notion of wishing and make believe, I think, also roots Aladdin into one of the most fantastical because you have a villain who often has some sorcery or magical aspect to them. And it's sort of not clear, but I often think of the Abanaza character is a person with magic rather than a magical being like a demon or somebody. You've obviously got the genie of the ring. You often have a genie of the genie of the lamp, genie of the ring. So it's one of those ones where actually magic plays a key component. And actually, in many pantomimes today, we're seeing magic take a little bit more of a back seat, whereas you
mm.
can't do that in Aladdin. Carpets don't fly on their own, and the lamp is so vital as part of that. And that allows for a great end of Act One reveal, doesn't it? I mean, that really is a build up to that moment and that transformation. It's also one of the
Mm.
pantomimes where you still, like Jack and the Beanstalk, you have to have, and Cinderella, that transformation at the end of Act One.
The interesting thing about the three wishes for me is it's still part of society today. People very often still say, well, if you had three wishes, what would you choose? Or, that sort of concept is still alive. And it also rings true with the rule of three, which is so important in comedy and pantomime as well. In terms of the actual structure, the script, the music, the casting, the sets, props, and so on. David, you said that this can be expensive because of some of those special
Mm.
effects and so on. It has particular demands, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And I think it's a tricky one in lots of ways, but it is also quite an easy one in lots of ways. I'll explain the whole thing of thinking how you capture the audience's imagination is vital, as we know. And in a heightened world of any theatrical experience, that can be quite tricky if you've got an audience which is made up of people who are used to looking on iPads or iPhones or whatever and not actually interacting with something. When you've got something which, like we're talking about the three wishes, which asks for them to be critical thinkers. I mean, I'm talking, in terms of what we're, the whole structure of panto, but the critical thinking of going, what would I want for my wishes is really important. That then opens the door up to going, how do we make, if the imaginative space is opened enough, does that then allow for something like a magic carpet that doesn't have all the bells and whistles to actually transcend the idea it needs to have all of the special effects, it needs to have all of these lights, all of this dry ice, all of this stuff? Does it literally need to be something that somehow floats over the front of the auditorium that they can't work out how it is, but then captures their imagination for these other big transformational moments? And because every character in Aladdin has an arc, every single one, the spirit of the ring, the genie of the ring wants to. So I've done a production where the genie and the spirit have been connected somehow. The genie would like to leave. Abanaza doesn't have enough power, so he wants to get the lamp to get more power from the genie. So there's these huge arcs that is asking a lot of the audience moralistically and in terms of igniting that imaginative space. I think Aladdin has the potential to be something not overblown is the wrong word, but almost overproduced. And I think a clever producer can look at that and go, how do I do this with the most using the audience's brain and imagination as well as using what I need set wise? There's a lot of stuff that needs to happen in Aladdin that doesn't normally, that is that, like we were talking about Jack and the Beanstalk. There is only a few things in Jack and the Beanstalk that kind of need to happen. For Cinderella, for example, there needs to be a carriage, a coach, a transformation scene. But once we're in the ballroom, we're in the ballroom. Aladdin, it keeps going, it keeps going, and it keeps going, which is part of the magic. But I do think the audience plays a massive part in how they see the magic, if that makes sense. So I think in terms of set and effects, I think they are part of it.
I think as well that that adventure element is crucial
Mm,
in the same way as Jack and the Beanstalk. The whole audience go with you on this journey, this adventure, which also helps in terms of box office and marketing and all that sort of stuff. This is and has been one of the most popular panto titles of all time. The Disney movie helped, but it
mm,
just sells each and every year. But Simon, we have to get to the elephant in the room because it has been criticized in terms of representation, racism, Orientalism, misrepresentation of cultures. It's a mishmash of cultures. How has it got to evolve to actually make sure that that criticism doesn't continue?
Yeah, and it's interesting to think, as you were saying, Martin, about that top five titles. Up until this year, you would have seen very frequently Aladdin, Cinderella, Jack and the Beanstalk, all at the top. This year, Aladdin actually is in fifth position
Mm.
after Cinderella, Jack and the Beanstalk, Sleeping Beauty, Beauty and the Beast. Then it's Aladdin. And that's because, as an industry, we're thinking about how do we ensure that such a great story with that narrative drive, with these great characters, with the opportunities for spectacle and storytelling and heart and emotion and narrative arc and character arc is done correctly, addressing all of that inherited history from the Victorian period when it was designed, like many pantomimes, to show pompously that Britain and often England was better than the rest of the world because it saw itself as the only place that could possibly be educated, the only place that knew how to do things rightly. And it was their job to educate and to invade and teach everyone else how to do it the British way. So, we are centuries on now, and we in the UK live in a very multicultural society. And there are some things, of course, which we can think about. One would be casting. Now, there are lots of reasons why titles fall out of the canon. We don't see many Robinson Crusoes. We don't see many Sinbads. Those are in the area that we're talking about here in terms of representation. You have characters who are not British if you're setting the story in its sort of original context and geographic area. Now, we do have a massive wealth of talent from people from the global majority in the UK, and you only have to look at Disney's musical Aladdin, which has played the West End, which has gone on tour, which has shown, that talent is there. And there are a number of producers that absolutely are doing fantastically and casting a cast that reflects the geographic location. Now, of course, it is fiction, and we are set very, very early on in that trajectory in a place in that area of China. In some places that might be Peking. In some stories, it might not be China. It might be Baghdad, for example. But I think today there are a number of things we can think about. One is we update most of the stories anyway. So how might we do that? Well, we could just represent the multicultural locale of the venue. So Lyric Hammersmith did that very successfully, set it in Hammersmith. The Emperor was a Boris Johnson inspired politician. Aladdin worked for his dad actually in this production, who was Dave Twankey, who enjoyed wearing dresses. So we're seeing characters representing sexualities and genders, as well as race and ethnicity within that. And it's interesting if we look at some of those strategies that have been employed by producers over the last 5 or 6 years, the relocation of that story has sort of been the dominant form of addressing some of these challenges. So still acknowledging that heritage with multicultural casts, but for example, Norwich Theatre Royal set theirs in a pie shop. Cheltenham had a sort of Las Vegas inspired, so still capturing that desert nature, but in Vegas in America. The most recent production of the Lyric Hammersmith had the magic enchanted cave as the middle Isle of Liddell because you can find absolutely anything there and it's fantastic. I saw a production years ago at the Georgian Theatre Royal in Richmond, which was set in the locale. Jasmine became Jazz, and we see that quite a lot these days. Aladdin, sometimes referred to as Al, and the cave there was a lockup, which they had to get the code for. And when the garage door opened, it was the wealth of pantomime props over the years that were there. And of course, we've seen Evolution do a similar thing with their Aladdin that's set in the Pun Emporium. Watford Palace's second act, way back over a decade ago, didn't go to Egypt. It went to Land of Snow and Ice. So I think there's lots of ways that we're addressing this and also relocating and thinking about, okay, who are the villains today? So we've had productions where certainly during the banking crisis, that 2010 production in Watford I mentioned, Abenazer was the worst possible person that they could be. They were a banker, gives you lots of opportunity there. I know Andrew Pollard has written him as Svengali, a magician, or Abracadabra magician, and we're seeing female Abenazers as well, which is fantastic. So it's a case of acknowledging that, but I think what's being done very cleverly is acknowledging also that history and heritage. So Widow Twankey, some productions are not using that name because of the derogatory nature that it was being used for teas. And some people are using Widow Twerky, acknowledging twerking as a dance craze. Or Widow Swanky, I imagine, has done that. Or, of course, as Vernon Kay was when he was in it, his surname was Lanky because he's so very tall. So lots of opportunities to update and change that. Same with Wishy, who's been Dishy, Soapy Simon, still having that opportunity for that slosh scene, that laundry scene, probably mostly with washing machines and a mangle. Although I always challenge everyone because I'm not sure how many of our younger audience members will have ever seen or know what the mangle is. But that is a wonderful moment where they sort of get squashed and then fluffed up in the dryer afterwards.
Yeah.
So I think we are slowly moving there. I mean, we've yet to see a production which has been written by people with Chinese heritage and is produced in that way collaboratively. I think that it would be a shame to relocate the story completely and completely not honor those roots. So there are so many productions which are figuring out ways to do this, and I think we're slowly making that march. And I think Aladdin will come back up in those league tables. It's just we're thinking of ways to represent the characters. So casting is key, and also, of course, those stories. And change can be slow, but as David said earlier as well, there are some key moments that you can do with set and you can play, because that's the great thing about pantomime. People always say to me, there's only a few stories. Why do you each year see so many shows and write about all these shows? Like, you're seeing, like, how many Jack and the Beanstalks have you seen? How many Cinderellas have you seen? But everyone is so different. And I know we've spoken about as well, Martin, a lot the importance of it being there for the local community, so reflecting the local community as well. And so it's got to take in all of those aspects today.
Yeah, and David, obviously, as a writer and director as well as an actor, you're obviously aware of this. And when you actually write a script or direct a script, you have to be really careful, because I think the criticism in Aladdin, more so than some of the other pantos, goes right to the heart of it in terms of the actual characters, in terms of where it's set and so on. Obviously, lots of the elements can remain, but they just have to evolve, don't they?
I agree. And I think that there was a bit of complacency and a bit of laziness in terms of the whole form of going, well, it's always this. This is what we've always done. And that kind of idea of going, the evolution of it, the development of it always causes problems. I think the two things for me that are important when I think about an Aladdin is, what are the archetypes and what do they serve? What is their dramaturgical arc? Where are they going? What do they need to achieve? And the second thing is, with something like Aladdin, of really just having a conversation and going, look, I'm in the process of directing this, I'm writing this, I'm trying to develop something that, as Simon was saying, holds on to those roots and those traditions, but actually is forward thinking and includes the areas and the worlds that we want to include. Have a conversation with someone who is really well known, who knows the area, who knows the world, is from the area, is from the world, and just go, look, this is what we're trying to put together. Because I think people that I've come across when I chatted to are quite frightened about even opening up the communication, because they're scared of saying the wrong thing. But actually, you have to kind of be brave about it and go, look, this is what I'd like to achieve. How can I make it as authentic as possible without mocking or mimicking or kind of belittling, and still keeping the sense of what these archetypes need to serve? Because I think it's key, but I think it's key for everything. Communication about how everything works needs to be a collaborative process, not just, well, this is how we did it before. This is what we've always done. We've all been in situations, decades ago where we watched things and cringed about how a lack of openness and awareness even about how uncomfortable this is kind of coming across. And I think that we are in a position where we can have those conversations and keep true to what the story is about. It's the setting is important, don't get me wrong,
Mm.
but like Simon, I've seen productions where they've been local and you kind of go, the Boris Johnson idea is brilliant. And you just have to look across the country and go, we have those elements of who these people are. And is that a way to reintroduce it cleverly by even looking into the area itself? There will be communities that are separate. There's a very separate kind of ness about not fitting into society, not being a part of the bigger picture of community, and actually going, we are quite isolated. Is that something to dig into? And I think it is. It's about archetypes and it's about communicating with people who are from that area and that region to really be clear about what are we doing here and how does it work.
If we look back at those stories, it's quite radical in the Victorian period
Mm.
that the show is about working class and about a single parent family who is a widow who's bringing up these children as best that they can. And I think if people are interested, they should certainly have a look into the work of the academic Dongxin Chan, who has written about Aladdin, the pantomime, and sees it as an opportunity for discussing culture and the
Mm.
multicultural nature of the UK today. He absolutely enjoyed seeing, I think he saw in one season about 20 Aladdins and recognizing Chinese culture on the stage, as well as some negative things, but many positive things. Because one of the things that we also should remember is this was, for many people in the Victorian era and maybe today, an opportunity to engage with another culture, a different culture, or a culture deeper than one might know already. And so wonderful practitioners, so like Daniel York Low or Alim Jadavji, they have done those roles like sensitivity readings or being
Mm.
people that were prepared to have a look at a script or be in and give feedback. Because as David said, we are a community, the pantomime industry, and everybody is here because we love the form. We think it's fantastic. We want it to survive. We know it needs to evolve. But nothing can match that feeling of being in the auditorium and being in that realm of Pantoland, where it's all about community on stage, in
Mm.
the audience, the community of theatre, the community of your locale, community of the characters. And there are lots of people out there that are absolutely open to having those discussions, to learning from the past to inspire the future. And, there are some real markers of this already happening. We won't see, I hope, and we haven't for many times, and I haven't been aware of production that uses the term slave anymore, for example.
Mm.
So there are things that we know have been making those steps. And as I said, there's some excellent practice out there. And as we've discussed, it's such a great narrative and a great story and great characters.
Now, I think the interesting thing about this is that in terms of political correctness, for instance, we've heard the announcement recently that Avenue Q is returning to the West End. We've seen Book of Mormon doing particularly well, both very politically incorrect in many ways. And many people would say that's a trope of pantomime, and it is in fact a backbone of British comedy. But political correctness is something quite different to what we're talking about, Simon, isn't it, really?
Yeah, I think one has to be very careful and think about audience intention and framing. Book of Mormon has a very particular audience. It's an adult audience. It's people that understand what's being presented on stage. There are, of course, aspects in there which may be interpreted as being, as you use the term, politically incorrect. And, the reboot of the latest season of South Park is a good example of that as well. That's a series that's been going on forever and ever
Mm.
and ever, a long, long time, which has often punched up to power, but also attacked and approached subjects and topics which one might think one shouldn't, or where we'd have a censor, they would be censored, or that they need some sensitivity. And Avenue Q, absolutely. But again, you're not really going to get any under 16s watching those shows. And I think
Mm.
we have to be very aware of pantomime's role in being often young people's first experience of the theatre. And it goes back to that significant role that fairy tales and narratives play within our lives as well. It's interesting if you look at children's television, for example, which is much more inclusive than it was 20, 30 years ago, because we know that from the studies, growing up and seeing yourself or people from your family or community, or even if you don't have or know anybody that might be of a different ethnicity or might have lived with parents with disabilities, being exposed to that is really important as part of growing up, as part of discovering the world, as part of understanding, what community is and getting and making friends and relationships. And so I suppose that is where it's very different in terms of those aspects where people have already grown up and can make those decisions and read things through a frame of comedy, to pantomime, which is catering for a wide cross-section of audience and society and prides itself on that diverse audience. I think in the UK, we're very lucky to have that. It's very, very, very special. And some might argue very, very unique as well. There's a duty of care to casts and audiences. Let's remember, it's not just audiences that might not feel comfortable watching something. There are many examples of cast members who absolutely don't feel comfortable about wearing that costume, being told to do their makeup in a certain way. That it's about what is deemed appropriate. And of course, that will change depending on the audience. What you would see in an adult panto, you wouldn't see in a panto for a family audience. And even at a school's audience, certain things might be taken out.
I think you're right. And I think, David, Simon's touched upon something there that is important. What we do not want to do is to reinforce discrimination. Stereotypes in many ways are an important part of panto. The dame is a stereotypical character. The comic, the baddie, they're all stereotypes, archetypal caricatures, if you like. But what we don't want to do is reinforce negative stereotypes. So we need to educate and re-educate. Now, some people might say, oh, well, let's set it here and let's not do that and we'll steer away from it completely. But in terms of diversity and representation, maybe it should be set in Peking and it should be, using representative actors from that culture, because if we want a diverse audience to come into the panto, we need to reflect that on stage as well.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point. And I think, where are we in terms of the kind of awareness of how that can work in our kind of panto community? I think we're getting there, but I think as a whole, I don't know where that fits. However, there is something really, really important about a point that Simon made about being in the audience and seeing representation, seeing yourself on stage, because I think the journey of the character is of utmost importance. And I think that finding what that journey is, I'm not going to say it's secondary to, it's above who they are and what they are as human beings, but I go, where is that balance? And I think that's what's key. I would love to see a production with absolutely an authentic production, but I then argue, but actually, what am I then watching? Because if I'm paying more attention to seeing, oh, this person is absolutely from this area, I understand. There's nuance within that. Even within one geographical area, there is more specificity to find. So actually, what are we talking about? Are we talking about the difference between north and south? In which case, it matters, of course, but how much does it matter, I suppose, is what I'm saying. I think it's really difficult. I think it's very, very difficult. I think theatre is for absolutely everybody. And I think that inclusion is of utmost importance. But where is the balance between what is this story saying and how are we setting it to make that story the most important thing? Because yes, of course, Peking is the place it was set in, but so is Hackney. So what is the relative historical value of where that is set compared to now? And where are we in terms of, say, Catford, Lewisham, Norwich, and how does Watford, where does that fit within that mould? Yeah, it's about lots of things, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I wanted
It's
to ask
about
you as
lots
well.
of things.
I wanted to
Yeah.
ask you as well, David, on, we've seen a change in recent years, more so than ever before, of not having principal boys. But historically, in Aladdin would have been played by not just a woman, but a white woman as well. So that's doubly
Yeah,
challenging, isn't it?
I think you're right. And I mean, that's another really kind of big thing to unpack. I really miss seeing a female identifying leading kind of principal boy character. I think there is something about it which is quite feminist and quite powerful, actually. But yeah, absolutely. I have been in productions where that has been the case. And I kind of think, again, I hate to say it, I think it's lazy. It has to serve what it needs to serve, of course. But then I go, are we just pushing a kind of an agenda of going, well, it needs to be the best person for the job, right? But on the same hand, that person has to fit the role specifically. And I think that having a white principal girl overcomplicates the whole idea and, quite frankly, is outdated. And we know better than doing that now.
Given everything we've talked about, Simon, do you think Aladdin has a bright future? You said it was, fifth in the rankings this year. Can it make its way back up to the top?
It's a good question. And I think the next 3 years are absolutely going to be vital in that to see how certain of the new productions that are being created are received. I think there is the potential there. Obviously, the Disney film is still very popular. The remake is popular. The musical is still running on Broadway. We've had the tours over here. As you said, it's ingrained in our culture. Three Wishes, Genie, much helped by the fabulous Robin Williams portrayal of the genie in the film, which has given us that archetypal sort of blue role. But I think we've got to crack these issues. And I was speaking to some writers who were saying the challenge is that Aladdin was the opportunity, of course, in the Victorian era to present a very different aesthetic. And actually, if each year you're doing English village, English village, English village, forest, does that actually get a little bit boring, dare I say it? So many of our titles, you could use the same set for 4 years, whether that's Snow White, Sleeping Beauty, maybe even Jack and the Beanstalk used the castle as a giant's castle, and it gave a very different aesthetic. My hope would really be that we're slowly seeing now more writing in pairs or teams to build upon lived experience and for cultural exchange, because that, and I mean, that's what I'm thinking is so exciting about the potential for Aladdin as an avenue for cultural exchange. Let's not beat around the bush. The UK is the best place in the world for theatre, full stop. We are so lucky with the training that we have here, with the talent pool that we have here, people coming here because they want to work on our stages, on our film sets, in our music industry. So I think it's a case of us sometimes looking a bit outside the industry about where those voices might be and inviting them in, maybe working alongside or with a very established or someone with a lot of experience, because that's the other factor. Pantomime as a genre is incredibly complex and incredibly specific. It's taught hardly anywhere. So it's not easy actually to come in and understand what's going on. For those of us that have lived, worked, breathed pantomime, yes, because we're doing it 12 months of the year. But it is a form particular to the UK. That doesn't mean it's only done in the UK. But I also think we can look outside to other places around the world that have also presented Aladdin as a pantomime, not in the UK, and see how they have done that and either created a production which has acknowledged the numerous cultures in cultural communities, bring it together. I mean, we have a big history of that within the UK. The Victorians presented Aladdin with a laundrette because many people from China who had come to live in the UK did work in laundrettes. I think most examples today of where we don't see that anymore. But of course, one of the most favourite cuisines of British people is the Chinese takeaway, and we're seeing the Chinese takeaway being integrated into pantomimes, as well as big places like Birmingham and London, where there's a thriving Chinese community in the Chinatowns there. People attend the New Year celebrations and great cultural interplay there. So I think Aladdin gives us that opportunity to do that, but we can't silence and not include people from China, people with Asian heritage and lived experience. So I really would like to see more of that, so that those roots are still there and honoured, but ripe for the 21st century. I would hate to see it go and disappear completely, like Sinbad, for example, like Robinson Crusoe, because we just haven't been prepared to approach those titles and to come to terms with them. And I think there is real commitment to with Aladdin.
One thing for sure, David, back in those music hall days, for instance, where a sketchy story would be brought to a theatre and all of the music hall acts would just put their set pieces in and so on. That's not good enough now, is it? You have to carefully think about every element from the writing stage onwards.
Absolutely. And I think that there is still that element that remains, but there is most definitely now, the complexity is hopefully still being examined and explored and made as deep as it can possibly be. Because also the audience it just won't accept that. They won't accept someone. I did, 100 years ago with Norman Wisdom, which was incredible. He did his act in Act 2. We had like 47 minutes off as the ensemble because he did his act. But people went to see Norman Wisdom because Norman Wisdom was stellar, like a massive, massive name. So when I suppose it's the difference when I suppose that type of status for the star, the top billing, then I suppose that still does exist to a certain extent. But when the story has to be served because the audience is just going to go, well, actually, that's not enough for me anymore. I'll see a little bit of a TV program celebrity that's come into the show. I'll see a little bit of what they do, but that can't be 47 minutes, obviously. So the story is paramount. And I've still got scripts where Dame enters, has 15 minutes, and it was a timing. And you think, I mean, that was back in the 80s, I'm sure we kind of think we remember. But I think the thing that serves the best is when that has a bit of a mix, where you have got the story is paramount, and then woven through it can be the kind of star turn, smaller moments.
Interestingly, we mentioned Norman Wisdom earlier on, who played Aladdin at the London Palladium. There was a small boy in the audience at one of those performances who went on to become one of the biggest movers and shakers in theatre and now owns the London Palladium. I'm talking about Baron Andrew Lloyd Webber, which is an incredible story, just showing how much of an impact panto has on many, many people. It's been fascinating talking about Aladdin with the two of you. Simon and David, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Martin.
Pleasure. Thank you, Martin.
And that's it for now. Don't forget to subscribe through your favourite podcast app, and make sure you join me, Martin Ballard, next time for episode 119, when I'll be chatting to somebody else we mentioned earlier in this episode, the Scottish actress, comedian and pantomime legend Elaine C. Smith.
Thank you for listening to the latest edition of Just Imagine, the podcast series from Imagine Theatre. And you can find out more by going to www.imaginetheatre.co.uk.